You might hear a kitty cat. She just got told she can't eat the fake plant, and she might be a little bit upset. Good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is for Friday, December 6th, 2024. And given that date, and as we mentioned last week, we do have a sermon presentation prepared, and we'll try to get that uploaded and ready to view at 11 Central Time tomorrow. That is Saturday, December the 7th. And I am going to step out of the way for a second here so that you can see something that you usually don't see. And that is our other kitty cat. This is Bit Bit, short for Bitty Kitty. Hello, kitty. For some odd reason, she decided she wants to sleep there on the top of the back of that couch. And so while usually she doesn't make an appearance, there she is. As you can see, I made good on my threat last week and went into the closet on laundry day and swapped out short sleeve shirts for long sleeve shirts. That usually lasts until sometime in March or April when it starts getting warm enough again that I think I ought to switch back. So for now, we're wearing long sleeve shirts. The weather has changed enough here that I felt that was an appropriate move. What else happened this week? Anything?
I'm so invested in the Karen Reed trial that I'm not aware of much of anything.
Uh, Even though the trial, well, we haven't heard yet. It's scheduled to be redone in January, but both the defense and the prosecution have.
They've been found not guilty, yet it looks like she's going to be retried, even though found not guilty.
On two of the three charges. They're going to retry her on all three of them because the judge declared a mistrial. Both the defense and the prosecution have asked the judge to hold off on the second trial until sometime in April. In part, that's because the prosecution brought in a special prosecutor to take the case the second time around, and he's needing time to familiarize himself with the case. But we haven't heard yet if the judge is going to grant that continuance.
Court without being prepared. Oh, I haven't read it yet. I mean, this is a court where it's actually been worked out that the DA himself is going to be subpoenaed and brought in as a witness. The shenanigans are just so false. The charges are just so ridiculous.
Well, there is a segment of the population of that particular community who insist that the community has been in the grips of corrupt officials for a very long time. Whether or not that's the bulk of the population, there are people there who are saying that.
The people of Canton are scared to death. They're afraid of the powerful cop family and the corrupt legal system that they have to live under. And a few people that are coming out and speaking out against it are finding themselves in trouble with the law.
Yeah. Yeah, and who knows, we have a new administration on the way, and the head of that administration has essentially said he wants to clean out all the, quote, swamp in Washington, and that may include cleaning out the officials who were investigating this state and these officials, and that might put an end to any attempt to hold these corrupt officials to account. We don't
Yeah.
know that yet. Anyway, that's not what we're here about. We're here to do our Friday night Bible study.
Well, what's going on? If I know what's going on, because right now that's where I'm invested. I'm so worried about that woman
Yeah.
and everybody living up there under those in that area.
Well, as I say, there's not a whole lot that went on this week here. There was something I was going to mention, but it was obviously not important, or I would have remembered it. So, we are about to get back to the story of Gideon. We're going to finish the familiar part of the story of Gideon. And then we're going to get into the less familiar part. And I will give you this preview of what's coming. When I started my junior year in high school, my parents sent me to an alternative school. I'm going to even tell you which school that was, because it's still there today. My junior year was the very first year that school operated. The doctors at Provo, Utah, bought the property and made it available to these people to start a school that summer. And so they went there and started building an administration building for the school. And my dad was driving truck to haul materials to them. He rented a flatbed truck, flatbed tractor trailer rig actually, to haul the structural steel down there. And he told me at the time he was a little nervous about it because if he would have to stop fast, he didn't have a real good way to stop that stuff, and it could come right through the cab. Those things have happened in the past. He was okay. He didn't have any situation where he had to panic stop. So he got the structural steel onto the site. He took me down there sometime during the summer, and the president of the school and the principal of the school both were busy laying block for the first floor of that administration building. And I remember that my dad showed up and they quoted him the line out of Jeremiah that they were doing a great work and could not come down. But that's just a side part of the story. So my junior year, one of the classes that they assigned me to was in lieu of a standard literature class, which these people didn't believe in because they believed if it was fiction, you shouldn't read it. They had a Bible literature class. And the first element of Bible literature that we studied is a parable that we will probably get to today in this class. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. I'd heard the story of Gideon a whole bunch of times from when I was in the Sunday school, Sabbath school type thing, but also then in elementary school at a church school. So the part of the story that we're in the middle of right now, I knew quite well, but that part I'd never run across before. And if you haven't heard the parable, you might find it kind of interesting. And it's when we interpret the parable, we're going to run the risk of getting political because it is essentially a political story. But we're not going to take sides in modern politics. We're simply going to make some comments about the nature of politics. So, and that'll be based on that parable. So let's start our study by having a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for the written word. And we thank you for all the provisions that you have made to heal a lost and broken world and the lost and broken individuals who inhabit it. We would like to be repaired and healed and restored to whatever it was you originally created us to become. And we don't really know what that is. So as we go to the written word, we understand that a proper understanding involves the prompting and assistance of the Holy Spirit. So we ask that you will send your Holy Spirit individually to each person as we do this, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So we read and stopped when we had finished Judges chapter 6. And so we had started the book of Judges 2 weeks ago. Last week we did chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so now we're ready for chapter 7, which picks up in the middle of the story of Jerub-baal. That is Gideon. So let me click the right button here, and there you can see. And it starts out saying, so Jerub-baal, that is Gideon, and his army got up early and went as far as the spring of Harod. Now that's not H-E-R-O-D, it's H-A-R-O-D. So it's not referring to the family that ruled Judea in the time of Jesus. The spring of Harod. The armies of Midian were camped north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Well, if that were the case, why hadn't they done it yet? But apparently God wants to make a point, and he knows human nature. And even if he helps us accomplish something, we humans have a tendency to think, oh, well, we did that. We didn't have any help. And not admitting it. So God, in this case, wants to make it clear that he is involved. Now, we have a problem if we say he's involved. But what we have to understand is that just because God was involved in seeking to deliver his people does not mean that he approves of everything that the people he selected and appointed to deliver his people chose to do in the process. So we'll read some of the things that Gideon did and we'll say, no, that wasn't right. At any rate, reading on, verse 3, therefore tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home. So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. So just over 2/3 of Gideon's army got up and left, when he made the statement that God required here, that they should say, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home. Now you'll notice there's a footnote there about this mountain. It says Mount Gilead, and the footnote also lets us know that it's not really clear from the Hebrew what mountain is meant, and they thought it might actually mean the mountain of Gilboa. Gilboa, as you may know, is the mountain where Saul and his sons fell in their final battle with the Philistines. And because of his sadness over the loss of his friend, David made a statement that may you receive neither dew nor rain. And so that has become a saying you might have heard at some point, as dry as the hills of Gilboa, which had neither dew nor rain. That saying comes from David's proclamation about the mountain after Saul and his sons died there. So that may be where he was. The point is, and I think that's why, while this is a bit interpretive, it's a good rendering. It doesn't matter where they were specifically. If they were timid or afraid, they could leave the mountain, leave the army, and not be part of what was about to happen. But the Lord told Gideon, there are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. When Gideon took his warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, divide the men into two groups. In one group, put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it up with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouths in the stream. Only 300 of the men drank from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. Now, I have heard interpretations of this test that God was testing to see who really was fit for the battle to come. But that assumes that God was sending them to battle. When we read what they were about to do, it wasn't really battle he was sending them to. The interpretation that I have heard is that if you are on your way to battle, you want to be alert and you want to press forward to do what you're being sent to do. So rather than making yourself vulnerable by getting down on your hands and knees in order to drink directly from the stream, you would scoop the water up with your hands and take the drink out of your hands rather than kneeling down to do it.
That's an object lesson for our lives.
All right, what is it?
Always be on guard and watchful that you don't lose your connection with your Creator.
Okay. Well, that may be what the person was intending, but I think they were also intending to say that only those best suited for the confrontation were going to be left. But that's not the point that God was making here. The point that God was making was that there were too many. And it was too likely that those who were there would take credit for what was about to happen. And in order to prevent that, God was weeding out, so to speak, those who would be most likely to take inappropriate credit. So if that interpretation that I heard was right, then these would be the men most eager to go into battle and kill Midianites. And then they would, in my mind anyway, be the ones more likely to take credit for what happened. So God was looking for the men who would be most likely to let him have the credit for what was about to happen. The point is that out of 32,000 men, Gideon now has only 300. The Lord told Gideon, "With these 300 men I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home." So Gideon collected the provisions and ram's horns of the other warriors and sent them home, but he kept the 300 men with him. The Midianite camp was in the valley just below Gideon. That night the Lord said, "Get up, go down into the Midianite camp, for I have given you victory over them. But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you will be greatly encouraged. Then you will be eager to attack." So Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. And I'm going to have to open this Bible to that passage because I had it open to a different passage in order to prepare our sermon presentation for tomorrow. I want to see if that's the name. Yep. And just for the fun of it, I'm going to check the King James Version real quick and see how they render the name there. It's probably the same. I just want to check and see. Okay, yeah. In the modern versions, they spell it P-U-R-A-H. In the King James, they spell it P-H-U-R-A-H.
Something smells funny. Are you cooking?
No, I turned the stove off.
Are you sure you're not cooking?
Well, you want me to go to the kitchen and check?
I think we need to check for this odor.
Well, maybe we need to check right there, the heater in your room. Huh? I don't smell anything. No, there's nothing coming from the kitchen. At any rate, it says Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. The armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east, so possibly even some Chaldeans, settled in the valley like a swarm of locusts. Their camels were like grains of sand on the seashore, too many to count. Gideon crept up just as a man was telling his companion about a dream. The man said, "I had this dream. And in my dream, a loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp. It hit a tent, knocked it over, turned it over, and knocked it flat." There's a nice visual for you. A loaf of bread rolling down the mountain, hitting a tent, turning it over, and knocking it flat. Yeah, okay. Now, why does it say barley bread?
Turning it. Did you say a loaf of bread rolling down the hill and knocking down a building?
A tent, yes.
Oh, I know somebody who could do that with her biscuits.
Oh.
Nobody in this room.
Yeah, right. My experience with barley comes from one summer when I helped a farmer and operated his combine. he owned an Alice Chalmers Gleaner E combine, and he harvested his own grain with it. He was a dairy farmer in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is it's essentially an extension of Wisconsin. So it would make sense you'd have a dairy farm in that territory. He had a dairy farm there. He milked, I think, in the neighborhood of 200 head of cattle. So he grew a lot of his own alfalfa for hay and grain and corn and so forth as feed for the cattle. And so he had a combine that he used to harvest those crops. And since he had it, he also did what we called custom harvesting for other farmers who had land and who grew these crops but didn't have the means to harvest them. They would pay him X number per hour for his machine and operator to show up and harvest his crop for him. And the way we operated the combine differed depending on whether I was doing one of his fields or whether I was doing custom work. Because with custom work, you wanted to get the most grain in the amount of time. The farmer was paying by the hour for your work and for the machine. So you would adjust the machine to get the bulk of the grain. So you wouldn't put the head down low because that meant you had to slow down to keep from choking the machine. You would lift the head up to get most of the grain, but you would leave a little grain that didn't come up high enough on out in the field still. But when he was cutting his own crops, and he wanted you to drop the head down real low and slow the machine down, because he wasn't paying anybody but you by the hour. He wasn't paying for the machine by the hour. He owned it. But at any rate, we harvested some wheat, we harvested oats, and we harvested barley. And of those crops, the one that was the worst to work with was the barley, because the dust that would come up off of it had a lot of barbs in it. It would irritate your skin, it would get in your eyes and cause problems. So the barley was the worst crop to work with. If I was doing oats or something, I wasn't so bad. So that's my experience with barley. But apparently they harvested barley as well as wheat, and they made bread from both grains. And what do you need?
Cookie, coffee, food. I need a cookie.
Isn't it there in your thing?
Oh, you've already given it to me?
Yeah.
Oh, you're so addicted. Where did you put it?
We apologize for the noise there. She's digging around in the pocket where she holds her phone to find her cookie. So.
Yeah, I can't take this on Nikki's stomach, and I'm.
Yeah, she's taking vitamin D, and apparently vitamin D is not absorbed well unless you take it with food. So here we were talking about barley loaf, and that made her hungry, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I said the word biscuit, and suddenly craving.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I'm not going to eat biscuit, but I will eat this cookie.
Well, you found it, I assume.
Yeah.
His companion answered, "Your dream can mean only one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite, victory over Midian and all its allies." Now, we don't have a name for either of these men, so we don't know who it was who interpreted the dream, a Joseph-like character apparently. And this is what Gideon heard. Now, we already know that Gideon had a little trouble trusting that when God called him to do something, God would be with him as he did so, which is why he had the tests about the fleece and the water. And now God says, yeah, I know you're a little timid still. Here, let's do this to boost your morale. So he sends him with his servant into the camp and has him arrive at the time that this dream is recounted and interpreted. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship before the Lord, or Yahweh. Footnote B, as in the Greek version, the Hebrew reads, he bowed. So the in worship was something that the Greek version added that apparently wasn't in the original Hebrew. Then he returned to the Israelite camp and shouted, "Get up, for the Lord has given you victory over the Midianite hordes." He divided his 300 men into 3 groups and gave each man a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. Now, in normal battle formation, you had a shield around your off arm and a sword in your primary arm. If you're right-handed, the sword would be in your right hand. If you were left-handed, the sword would be in your left hand. The shield would be in your right arm. That's standard battle equipment for the time, but that's not the equipment these men have. God is not sending them out to murder and destroy. He's sending them out to deliver his people by different means. So instead of sword and shield, they get ram's horn and a torch under a clay pitcher. And then he said to them, "Keep your eyes on me. When I come to near the edge of the camp, do just as I do. As soon as I and those with me blow the ram's horns, blow your horns too, all around the entire camp, and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Guess he just had to throw himself in there, but maybe since he was aware now that the people in the valley knew his name, he believed that using his name in the shout would help in what he was going to do. It was just after midnight, after the changing of the guard, Hebrew at the beginning of the second watch. So normally the night would be divided into 3 4-hour watches. So, I don't know, the first watch began at 6 p.m., you would think. Your second watch would be 10 to 2, and your third watch would be 2 to 6. But anyway, so they're saying here, let's go back up, just after midnight, after the changing of the guard, when Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the Midianite camp. Suddenly they blew the ram's horns and broke their clay jars. Then all 3 groups blew their horns and broke their jars. They held the blazing torches in their left hands and the horns in their right hands, and they all shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." They didn't have one, they just shouted about it. Each man stood at his position around the camp and watched as all the Midianites rushed around in a panic, shouting as they ran to escape. When the 300 Israelites blew their ram's horns, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their swords. And again, this is the Hebrew interpretation. It happened, therefore the Lord caused it to happen. That's how they thought. Those who were not killed fled to places as far away as Beth Shittah near Zerera, and to the border of Abel-Meholah near Tabith. Then Gideon sent for the warriors of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, who joined in chasing the army of Midian. Gideon also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down to attack the Midianites. Cut them off at the shallow crossings of the Jordan River at Beth-barah." Now this is Gideon now speaking. This is how he wants to handle it. He's got them on the route. They're fighting each other. They're fleeing. But Gideon wants to cut them off, to stop their escape and cut them down. So all the men of Ephraim did as they were told. They captured Oreb and Zeb, the two Midianite commanders, killing Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. So these places probably got their names because of the kings who were killed at those locations. And they continued to chase the Midianites. Afterward, the Israelites brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan River. So the battle ended in a bloodbath, but even in the flawed Old Testament narrative, it is God who told Gideon what to do. It is Gideon who decided to go beyond that and call out forces and engage in the bloodshed. Judges chapter 8. Then the people of Ephraim asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us this way? Why didn't you send for us when you first went out to fight the Midianites?" And they argued heatedly with Gideon. But Gideon replied, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't even the leftover grapes of Ephraim's harvest better than the entire crop of my little clan of Abiezer? God gave you victory over Oreb and Zeb, the commanders of the Midianite army. What have I accomplished compared to that?" When the men of Ephraim heard Gideon's answer, their anger subsided. So apparently Gideon had some skills at defusing tense situations, and he was able to placate these Ephraimites, these members of the tribe of Joseph, by essentially by flattering them, saying, "Well, you're greater than I am. Why are you complaining?" And they accepted the flattery, and their anger abated, and we go on. Gideon then crossed the Jordan River with his 300 men, and though exhausted, they continued to chase the enemy. When they reached Succoth, Gideon asked the leaders of the town, "Please give my warriors some food. They are tired. I am chasing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." So 2 of the kings have already been killed, but Gideon still wants to get the other 2 that are named here. But the officials of Succoth replied, "Catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, then we will feed your army." So Gideon said, "After the Lord gives me victory over Zebah and Zalmunna, I will return and tear your flesh with the thorns and briars from the wilderness." So Gideon didn't take their refusal particularly kindly. From there, Gideon went up to Peniel, and let's see, the Hebrew says Peniel, which is a variant spelling of Peniel, and in verses 9 and 17, we'll see the same thing done. And again asked for food, but he got the same answer. So he said to the people of Peniel, "After I return in victory, I will tear down this tower." So again, he didn't take their refusal to provide provisions for his 300 graciously, and he threatened them. By this time, You started talking while I was talking, so the phone didn't let you come through.
I said it wasn't like David did, was it?
How is it different?
Well, David provided protection, and then he asked for payment.
Yeah.
Payment, so he decided to go destroy not only Nabal, but also all of his male servants. But David had a weakness, didn't he?
Yeah.
And that weakness had a head on her shoulders.
Yeah.
His weakness and her smart saved a lot of lives.
Yeah. And when we cover that story, we'll talk about what the Bible says it means. At any rate, by this time Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with about 15,000 warriors, all that remained of the allied armies of the east, for 120,000 had already been killed. Gideon circled around by the caravan route east of Nobah and Jerub-baal, taking the Midianite army by surprise. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two Midianite kings, fled, but Gideon chased them down and captured all their warriors. After this, Gideon returned from the battle by way of Harris Pass. There he captured a young man from Succoth and demanded that he write down the names of all the 77 officials and elders in the town. Gideon then returned to Succoth. Remember, that's the town that wouldn't feed his army while he was chasing them. And said to the leaders, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna. When we were here before, you taunted me, saying, 'Catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we will feed your exhausted army.'" Then Gideon took the elders of the town and taught them a lesson, punishing them with thorns and briars from the wilderness. So he got a little bit vicious with all that. He also tore down the tower of Peniel and killed all the men in the town. Then Gideon asked Zebah and Zalmunna, "The men you killed at Tabor, what were they like?" "Like you," they replied. "They all had the look of a king's son." "They were my brothers, the sons of my own mother," Gideon exclaimed. "As surely as the Lord lives, I wouldn't kill you if you hadn't killed them." Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword, for he was only a boy and was afraid. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said to Gideon, "Be a man, kill us yourself." So Gideon killed them both and took the royal ornaments from the necks of their camels. So I told you, this is not the part of the story of Gideon that we tell the children. We skip this bit. But it is part of the story of Gideon. And even though God took the precaution of reducing his army to just 300 men, once Gideon had a taste of victory, he kind of let it go to his head, and he became vicious and mean-spirited. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers, for you have rescued us from Midian." But Gideon replied, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you." Well, that's what God intended. And of course, God doesn't rule over the way humans rule over. And, maybe Gideon understood that. And we can at least give him the credit that he refused to become the people's king or ruler. However, he says, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies. The enemies, being Ishmaelites, all wore gold earrings. Gladly, they replied. They spread out a cloak, and each one threw in a gold earring he had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, and that is actually 1,700 shekels, which we believe is about 19.4 kilograms. So that's how they came up with that rendition. Not including the royal ornaments and pendants, the purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of their camels. Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. So even at the time that the book of Judges was written, the Old Testament authors recognized that what Gideon did by making this sacred ephod was not a wise move, because it led to idolatry and became a problem. That is the story of how the people of Israel defeated Midian, which never recovered. Throughout the rest of Gideon's lifetime, about 40 years, there was peace in the land. And then Gideon, footnote C, the Hebrew says Jerub-baal, son of Joash, returned home. He had 70 sons born to him, for he had many wives. He also had a concubine in Shechem, who gave birth to a son whom he named Abimelech. Now this is important, because once again we're going to have the son of a concubine involved in the story. And this son of a concubine is going to make trouble in a lot of it. Gideon died when he was very old, and he was buried in the grave of his father Joash at Ophrah in the land of the clan of Abiezer. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping the images of Baal, making Baal Berith their god. They forgot the Lord their God, who had rescued them from all their enemies surrounding them. Baal Berith would mean Lord of Berith, or the god of that particular territory. Nor did they show any loyalty to the family of Jerub-baal, that is Gideon, despite all the good he had done for Israel. And with that, we conclude chapter 8 of the book of Judges. So we see how Gideon, who started out having a relationship with his Creator, ended up in a less positive place. Whether or not he himself engaged in false worship because of the ephod he had made, the people around him did, and because he had made the thing, well, then that was at least partly his responsibility. And now he's going to have sons, and this is going to create trouble in the next chapters. So we move on to Judges chapter 9. One day, Gideon's son, and that footnote A probably is going to say that the Hebrew says Jerub-baal. Yes, there, footnote B. Okay, so. Now, mind you, we're now talking about Shechem. Shechem, if you'll recall, is the place where Jacob stayed with his sons. And while they were there, the king's son had sex with Jacob's daughter, Dinah, and Jacob's sons took offense and conspired to kill all the men of the city, forcing Jacob to leave the area. And while he was fleeing, his wife, the wife he loved, Rachel, gave birth to her second son and died in childbirth. And some have suggested that that was because of that flight. At any rate, that's where we are. We're at that city, and now the Israelites have moved in there and taken it over. So one day, Gideon, or Jerub-baal's son Abimelech, went to Shechem to visit his uncles, his mother's brothers. He said to them and to the rest of his mother's family, "Ask the leading citizens of Shechem whether they want to be ruled by all 70 of Gideon's sons or by one man. And remember that I am your own flesh and blood." So Abimelech's uncles gave his message to all the citizens of Shechem on his behalf. And after listening to this proposal, the people of Shechem decided in favor of Abimelech because he was their relative. They gave him 70 silver coins from the temple of the false god Baal-berith, which he used to hire some reckless troublemakers who agreed to follow him. He went to his father's home at Ophrah, and there, on one stone, they killed all 70 of his half-brothers, the sons of Gideon. But the youngest brother, Jotham, escaped and hid. And again in verse 5 there, that reference to Gideon in the Hebrew is actually Jerub-baal. So Abimelech goes to his hometown, gets them, to the hometown of his mother, gets them to name him their leader, and uses that as an excuse to gather together a small army to go back to his father's town and to kill all his half-brothers. All of Gideon's sons, except for the one who escaped. Not a very pretty picture. Or, as I said last week, Israelite men behaving badly. Then all the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo called a meeting under the oak beside the pillar at Shechem and made Abimelech their king. Now I recall from being down there before that the footnote C there says that the meaning of the Hebrew there is uncertain. So they've rendered it this way. That's the best sense they can make of it, but they're not certain. And now we've reached the parable I told you about before we got started. Jotham's parable. Now recall that Jotham is the one son of Gideon who escaped with his life when all of his brothers and half-brothers, because Gideon had sons by many wives, were killed there at Ophrah. When Jotham heard about this, he climbed to the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted. Now, Mount Gerizim is the mount that would be the mountain of worship for the Samaritans after the return from captivity in the late Old Testament. That's not what it is yet, but it is one of the two mountains, the mountain of blessings, the mountain of curses. So he climbs to this mountain so everybody can hear him, and he shouts, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem. Listen to me if you want God to listen to you." Now he starts his parable. Once upon a time, the trees decided to choose a king. First, they said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree refused, saying, "Should I quit producing the olive oil that blesses both God and people just to wave back and forth over the trees?" And then they said to the fig tree, "You be our king." But the fig tree also refused, saying, "Should I quit producing my sweet fruit just to wave back and forth over the trees?" And I want to see that in the King James, because I'm going to guess it doesn't say wave back and forth. It says something a little different. If I can get a single page to turn here. Well, the King James says, "Be promoted over." All right. I'm going to check the NIV then, which is the one I'm used to reading, just to see how it puts it. Hold sway over the trees. Yeah, this is a highly interpretive version. Wave back and forth. It does suggest, I guess, it gives us a sense of the futility that these trees see in being rulers. I could hold sway over you. I could be in charge of you. But what would that mean? I was just waving back and forth over the trees. The point is, these two so far have refused rulership. And recall that the people had asked Gideon to be their ruler, and he had refused. So Jotham in this parable makes reference to that fact, reminding the people, "My father refused to be your ruler." Then they said to the grapevine, "You be our king." But the grapevine also refused, saying, "Should I quit producing the wine that cheers both God and people just to wave back and forth over the trees?" Then all the trees finally turned to the thorn bush and said, "Come, you be our king." And the thorn bush replied to the trees, "If you want to make me your king, come and take shelter in my shade. If not, let fire come out from me and devour the cedars of Lebanon." Now, Jotham has engaged in some very apt and intelligent use of metaphor in telling this parable. Because when he gets to the end, he talks about the one who does want to be the king, and he illustrates the arrogance that is involved. How would a cedar in Lebanon take shelter in the shade of a thorn bush? The very idea is ridiculous. And I think Jotham specifically used this metaphorically to make the point that his son of a concubine half-brother was not a great person. But he was engaging in a lot of unwarranted arrogance. And he was also going to be vicious and violent, as was this thorn bush. Let fire come out from me and devour the cedars of Lebanon. I'm better than all of you, even though obviously he wasn't. Jotham continued, now make sure you have acted honorably and in good faith by making Abimelech your king, and that you have done right by Gideon and all of his descendants. Have you treated him with the honor he deserves for all he accomplished? For he fought for you and risked his life when he rescued you from the Midianites. But today you have revolted against my father and his descendants, killing his 70 sons on one stone. And you have chosen his slave woman's son, Abimelech, to be your king just because he is your relative. If you have acted honorably and in good faith toward Gideon and his descendants today, then may you find joy in Abimelech, and may he find joy in you. But if you have not acted in good faith, and now he borrows even further from his metaphor, then may fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and may fire come out from the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. So he's making it mutual here, reciprocal. Fire comes out from him to devour you, and fire comes out from you to devour him. And he's borrowing from the metaphor that he used in his parable. Now let's go back and think about that parable a little bit, because he makes a point here. Not only is he talking about how the people are reacting to his father Gideon, who had delivered the people, but he's also talking just in general about the whole sordid business of government. If you choose a king, who will you get? And he used 3 examples here: the olive tree, the fig tree, and the grapevine. All of these trees are productive. They make the world a better place for their existence. They do good things for people. The tree produces its olive, or its oils, the olive oil. And that olive oil gets a lot of uses. It's a fundamental part of the diet. It's also, because the olive oil is high in calories, so it's helpful in that way. It's also used ceremonially, so that it's used in the worship of God. The fig tree, so now you have the fruit of the fig, which is nutritive and good tasting. And then you have the grapevine, which produces grapes and the juice, and if the juice is left long enough, it becomes alcoholic and becomes a beverage. But all of these things help the people. And if they are truly productive and beneficial, it doesn't make sense to take them out of that role and put them in government. Because then you would lose the good that they produce. And so in our own society, when people are being productive and really doing good for a society, it's not a good idea to take them out of those roles and put them in governing roles, because we simply deprive ourselves of the benefits of them acting in their original role. So, who ends up being rulers? Well, in Jotham's parable, that's the thorn bushes, the weeds, the the plants with destructive characteristics, the people who aren't so good at benefiting society, and so when they divert their efforts towards governing, the society doesn't lose as much. But unfortunately, then once they're placed in positions of political power, they begin to think they're quite something. They get arrogant, just as the thorn bush thought that it was appropriate for the big trees to take to come hide in the shade of the thorn bush. It's ridiculously arrogant. And so our rulers become arrogant and they become violent and they become vindictive and so forth. And that's why we'll never find a solution for our problem in politics, because we'll never let the people who could do the job right do it, because we need them in their original roles. And the people who are willing to go to all the effort it takes to get themselves elected, usually, by the very fact they're willing to endure all that, are demonstrating that they're too arrogant and self-important to be trusted with ruling us. And so we end up with mediocre rulers, and we keep electing the other party to be in charge because we didn't like what the current party did. Then we don't like what that party did, so then we switch back. Reminds me of a cartoon I saw once. And this will be a little bit more meaningful for people who are in the United States and know the abbreviations that we use for the two major political parties. The cartoonist drove a car stuck crosswise in a very narrow alley where there wasn't room for it to move forward or backwards. And they kept moving the shift lever from D to R. Drive reverse, and you can guess what else the D and the R might stand for. And they just keep shifting back and forth, and they're not getting anywhere because the car's stuck the wrong way in that narrow alley. So that's how political we're going to get. We're not going to take sides. We're just going to say this whole business of government is problematic, and it's not going to solve our problems. Yes, we have to have government. We have to have some way to prevent mob rule, and the what's going to happen being decided by the people most willing to be violent and to kill in order to get what they want. And in order to avoid that, we make government. And as long as we're in a broken, sinful world, we can't survive without it. But it's not a great thing to live with either. So, Jotham has said what he has said, and then it concludes in verse 21. Then Jotham escaped and lived in Beer, or well, that's what beer, the Hebrew beer, means, because he was afraid of his brother Abimelech. Story's not over, as you can see. After Abimelech had ruled over Israel for 3 years, God sent a spirit. Well, whether God actually did it or not, that's the interpretation of the authors of this book, that stirred up trouble between Abimelech and the leading citizens of Shechem, and they revolted. And the view that these writers take is that God was punishing Abimelech for murdering Gideon's 70 sons, and the citizens of Shechem for supporting him in this treachery of murdering his brothers. Now, there's a sense in which we could say that because God is acting in his wrath, and we know that when God acts in anger or wrath like that, what he does is let go and give people up to their stubbornness and to the natural results of the stupid decisions they have made. So you might imagine Jotham saying to the people, FAFO, if you know what that means. And so the people did, in fact, FAFO. They found out. So it says here that the citizens of Shechem set an ambush for Abimelech on the hilltops and robbed everyone who passed that way. But someone warned Abimelech about their plot. One day, Gaal, son of Ebed, moved to Shechem with his brothers and gained the confidence of the leading citizens of Shechem. During the annual harvest festival at Shechem, held in the temple of the local god, notice that's lowercase, the wine flowed freely and everyone began cursing Abimelech. Who is Abimelech? Gaal shouted. He's not a true son of Shechem, so why should we be his servants? Footnote D there after Shechem. Who is Shechem? Well, all right. Who is Abimelech? Who is Shechem? So why should we be his servants? He's merely the son of Gideon, and this Zebul is merely his deputy. Serve the true sons of Hamer, the founder of Shechem. Well, now Hamer was a Canaanite. Hamer was the father of Shechem. Shechem was the one who they imagined raped Dinah when she was 12. So they go on and say, why should we serve Abimelech? If I were in charge here, I would get rid of Abimelech. I would say to him, get some soldiers and come out and fight. Footnote E, let's see what that says. As in the Greek version, the Hebrew reads, and he said. Ah, okay. So he's either calling on Abimelech to come out and fight, or he's calling on the people of Shechem to come out and fight. He's calling for a fight, is essentially what he's doing. But when Zebul, the leader of the city, heard what Gaal was saying, he was furious. He sent messengers to Abimelech in Arumah. Remember, Zebul is Abimelech's servant, essentially. He sent messengers to Abimelech in Arumah, telling him, Gaal, son of Ebed, and his brothers have come to live in Shechem, and now they're inciting the city to rebel against you. Footnote F on that Arumah, by the way. Or in secret. The Hebrew reads in Torah. Compare chapter 9, verse 41. So he sent messengers to where he was, or he sent messengers in secret so that the people wouldn't know that he was telling Abimelech what was going on. Now they're inciting the city to rebel against you. Come by night with an army and hide out in the fields. In the morning, as soon as it is daylight, attack the city. When Gaal and those who are with him come out against you, you can do with them as you wish. So Abimelech and all his men went by night and split into 4 groups, stationing themselves around Shechem. So they're going to essentially surround the city. Gaal was standing at the city gates when Abimelech and his army came out of hiding. When Gaal said to them, he said to Zebul, look, there are people coming down from the hilltops. Zebul replied, it's just the shadows on the hills that look like men. But again Gaal said, no, people are coming down from the hills. And another group is coming down the road past the diviner's oak. Now we got two footnotes there. Let's go down and check those. G and H, scent of the land, or the Hebrew Elon Meonium. Meonenim. Elon Meonenim. Took me a second there. Have to sound that one out. All right. So at any rate, Zebul, he's on Abimelech's side. He knows that Abimelech has responded. He sees these people. So he's trying to prevent Gaal from taking action before Abimelech gets the advantage. So he said, you're just seeing shadows. That just looks like men. But then Gaal sees them again. Then Zebul turned on him and asked, now, where is that big mouth of yours? Wasn't it you that said, who is Abimelech, and why should we be his servants? The men you mocked are right outside the city. Go out and fight them. You ever heard of a catalyst? A catalyst is a chemical that doesn't really take part in a chemical reaction, but it does set it off. I think Zebul's acting like a catalyst here. He's probably not willing to fight himself, but he thinks it's neat to watch people fight, so he calls on his shall I say mentor, his boss essentially, and reports on what's going on in the city. And now, in talking to the rebel in the city, he's goading him on to go out there and fight his boss Abimelech. So Gaal led the leading citizens of Shechem into battle against Abimelech, but Abimelech chased him, and many of Shechem's men were wounded and fell along the road as they retreated to the city gate. Abimelech returned to Arumah, and Zebul drove Gaal and his brothers out of Shechem. The next day, the people of Shechem went out to the fields to battle. When Abimelech heard about it, he divided his men into 3 groups and set an ambush in the fields. When Abimelech saw the people coming out of the city, he and his men jumped up from their hiding places and attacked them. Abimelech and his group stormed the city gate to keep the men of Shechem from getting back in, while Abimelech's other 2 groups cut them down in the fields. The battle went on all day before Abimelech finally captured the city. He killed the people, leveled the city, and scattered salt all over the ground. In other words, he's going to make the ground so it's no longer productive. That's the means they had for that day. We'd use chemicals, but he essentially wants to make it an arid and desolate place. When the leading citizens who lived in the Tower of Shechem heard what had happened, they ran and hid in the temple of Baal-berith, that is, of their false god. And that's footnote I. El-berith, another name for Baal-berith. El was one of the names of God. El or Elohim, Elohim being plural. El-berith, Lord of Berith, or Baal-berith, the Lord of Berith. Essentially, it's talking about the same place, just different way of referring to it. At any rate, the people who had lived in the Tower of Shechem heard that. They ran and hid in the temple. Then someone reported to Abimelech that the citizens had gathered in the temple. So he led his forces to Mount Zalmon. He took an axe and chopped some branches from a tree, then put them on his shoulder. Quick, do as I have done, he told his men. So each of them cut down some branches, following Abimelech's example. They piled the branches against the walls of the temple and set them on fire. So all the people who had lived in the Tower of Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. Then Abimelech attacked the town of Thebez and captured it. But there was a strong tower inside the town, and all the men and women, the entire population, fled to it. They barricaded themselves in and climbed up to the roof of the tower. Abimelech followed them to attack the tower, but as he prepared to set fire to the entrance, a woman on the roof dropped a millstone that landed on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. He quickly said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me. Don't let it be said that a woman killed Abimelech." Typical male chauvinist approach here. It would be humiliating and shameful to be killed by a woman. So, you're a man, quick, kill me so that I won't die of the wounds that this woman has inflicted, and it would be said that a woman killed me. So the young man ran him through with his sword, and he died. When Abimelech's men saw that he was dead, they disbanded and returned to their homes. In this way, the author concludes, God punished Abimelech for the evil he had done against his father by murdering his 70 brothers. We've read what was really behind this fight. There were people who wanted it to happen, and God gave these people over to the nonsense that they were choosing. And just like Jotham had predicted in his parable and then in his interpretation of his parable, fire came out from Abimelech and devoured Shechem. Fire came out from Shechem and devoured Abimelech. But at any rate, the author concludes, in this way God punished Abimelech for the evil he had done against his father by murdering his 70 brothers. God also punished the men of Shechem for all their evil, so the curse of Jotham, son of Gideon, was fulfilled. So there we have the perhaps the first parable told in the Bible. And we have the story of Gideon and his sons. And again, not a particularly pretty story. We've got a few minutes. I'm not sure what the next chapter is, but I think we'll go ahead and get into it.
Let me ask you something.
All right.
You said that's not a very particularly pretty story.
No.
Who among us has a pretty story?
Well, I mean, we like to read the story of Jesus and of the early church because we find that positive and uplifting.
Yeah,
But we don't find the story of what happened here particularly uplifting. It's gruesome and violent and off-putting.
Yeah, I agree.
But you're saying that's what life is really like, huh?
Being hung on a cross is not exactly pleasant, I wouldn't imagine.
No.
I don't think there's anybody who's had a wonderful, 100% wonderful experience.
Well, no, not as long as we live on this broken planet. No, that's not going to happen. After Abimelech died, Tola, son of Puah, son of Dodo, was the next person to rescue Israel. He was from the tribe of Issachar, but lived in the town of Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He judged Israel for 23 years. When he died, he was buried in Shamir. After Tola died, Jair from Gilead judged Israel for 22 years. His 30 sons rode around on 30 donkeys, and they owned 30 towns in the land of Gilead, which are still called the towns of Jair. Footnote A. When Jair died, he was buried in Canaan. Towns of Jair, or Havoth Jair. And we'll read that term, Havoth Jair, in the future. Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They served the images of Baal and Ashtoreth and the gods of Aram, Sidon, Moab, Ammon, and Philistia. They abandoned the Lord and no longer served him at all. So the Lord burned with anger against Israel, and he turned them over to the Philistines and the Ammonites, who began to oppress them that year. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites east of the Jordan River, in the land of the Amorites, that is, in Gilead, the Transjordan tribes, in other words. The Ammonites also crossed to the west side of the Jordan and attacked Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. So, in other words, the Ammonites got into what we today would call the West Bank. The Israelites were in great distress. Finally, they cried out to the Lord for help, saying, "We have sinned against you because we have abandoned you as our God and have served the images of Baal." The Lord replied, "Did I not rescue you from the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, and the Maonites? When they oppressed you, you cried out to me for help, and I rescued you. Yet you have abandoned me and served other gods, so I will not rescue you anymore. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them rescue you in your hour of distress." So here again we see God acting as we know he does in his wrath, and that is, he leaves them, he gives them up essentially to the natural consequences of their choices. I mean, this says, well, you've chosen those gods, so let those gods help you. But the Israelites pleaded with the Lord and said, "We have sinned. Punish us as you see fit, only rescue us today from our enemies." Then the Israelites put aside their foreign gods and served the Lord, or Yahweh, and he was grieved by their misery. At that time the armies of Ammon had gathered for war and were camped in Gilead, and the people of Israel assembled and camped at Mizpah. The leaders of Gilead said to each other, "Whoever attacks the Ammonites first will become ruler over all the people of Gilead." So, that was a short chapter, only those 18 verses. We got through it relatively quickly. I feel a little bit vindicated in my choice to go on to one more chapter, because now we have about reached the length of time that we usually use for our Friday night Bible study. So we have finished chapter 10 of the book of Judges. We'll go on from there. There are more difficult to understand stories in the rest of this book. As I said, Israelite men behaving badly, doing things that we wouldn't think creator honoring people would do. But just because you claim to honor the creator doesn't mean that you have fully healed yourself and yielded yourself to that character and to that approach to life and living. Desiring the kingdom of God does not allow you to begin kingdom living fully, because it's always a process with us humans. We submit, but we only submit certain things, and we're still stuck stubbornly in certain ways, and we don't give those things up to God yet, so then he can't fix them. So it's a process that continues for all our lifetimes, because we're human, we're hard-headed, and we don't see things the way we ought to see them. That's just part of being human. God knows it, and he's willing to work with us.
It's hard to learn to accept that you've been wrong.
Yeah. And of course there's that little saying from Garfield. "I thought I was wrong once, but I was mistaken."
Right.
There are people that are like that, who can never admit that they made a mistake or that they were wrong about something. But you cannot grow if you assume that you've always been right, because then you're stuck where you were. But anyway.
And then there's the kid who comes home from school and his mom says, "How'd you do on your grammar test?" And he said, "I made 100%. I only made one mistake and I seen it as soon as I done it."
Yeah. Yeah, he didn't pass that grammar test, did he?
No. I think he's writing for the internet is what I think.
Yeah. Well, at any rate, we do plan to produce the sermon presentation and have it available on the group tomorrow at 11 Central Time. Now, for those of you who view these studies on YouTube, I do not put the sermon presentations on YouTube. My goal for the YouTube channel is to eventually have the videos in sequence from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, to have the whole Bible through covered in the videos that are on YouTube. And since the sermon presentations aren't part of that, I'm not putting them there. So if you view these on YouTube and you would like to see the sermon presentation, you'll have to go to the Facebook group, In Vain Do They Worship Me, and that's where we put up the sermon presentations. And we don't guarantee anything, but the plan is to have it available on the group at 11 o'clock Saturday, December 7th, 2024. So until then, and until next week when we pick up with Judges chapter 11, which I think is the story of, is it Japheth? The one who sacrificed his daughter? At any rate, that's where we'll go next week. So until then, we say goodbye and God bless.